A pedigree is simply a picture that shows a family tree and also the interrelationships of the parents and the children across multiple generations. The link that you see on this slide, that link is posted in your web links for chapter 14, and it does give you a very general introduction to pedigrees. This picture right here shows us what a typical pedigree would look like. Now, if we talk about the different things that we can determine from looking at this, first off, the males and the females are distinguished based on their shape. The males are always represented with squares, and the females are always represented with circles. Additionally, if you have a line that connects two individuals, so a horizontal line such as this one here and this one right here, that indicates a mating. So if we look at the line that drops down directly below them from this couple, we can see that they actually had two children. So they have two children. Those two children are both daughters. This couple over here had 4 children. They had 3 sons and a daughter. Another thing that we can see when we look at a pedigree like this is we can see generations. The generations are in the rows. So this would be the first generation up here. This would be the second generation. This would be the third generation down here towards the bottom. We can see all the relationships between individuals. So if we were to focus in on one of these girls down here at the bottom, this would be her father. This would be an uncle on her father's side. This would be an aunt on her father's side. We could say that this would be the paternal grandmother, this would be the paternal grandfather, and so on. So there's a lot of things we can see just about the relationships between people when we look at the pedigree. But pedigrees are usually drawn with a particular trait in mind. So that can be an appearance, it can be a genetic disorder, but they're drawn typically when there is something that runs in a family and we want to perhaps predict the possibility of having a child that looks like this or that, or that may have a genetic disorder. So whatever it is that we're interested in, there will be certain individuals that have it. These are what we call the affected individuals, and they're going to be shaded or colored in. So if this was drawn for a particular genetic disorder, we would shade or color in all of the individuals that we know of that have that particular disorder. Now, because we can draw a pedigree for whatever purpose we have in mind, just being colored in does not really tell us if those individuals have the dominant phenotype or if they have the recessive phenotype. So that really is the first question that we need to answer when we are presented with a pedigree. We need to decide if the colored in individuals are dominant or recessive. So if we look at a dominant pedigree first, by calling this a dominant pedigree, we're saying that all of the affected individuals have the dominant phenotype. So if they have the dominant phenotype, by default, the non-colored in individuals would have the recessive phenotype. If we are dealing with a dominant pedigree, things that we would be looking for is basically if we can find an individual that has that dominant look at the bottom of the pedigree, we should be able to find at least one of their parents is going to have it, because notice if they are colored in, they've got at least one capital letter, and that capital letter had to come from at least one of their parents. So notice we can trace this back. This person has it. Actually, both of their parents happen to have it. Each of their parents, we have at least one that has it as well. So this is not going to be something that skips generations. Many times you hear people talk about things that skip generations. Dominant things do not skip generations. Another characteristic that we typically see when we're looking at a dominant pedigree, or that we can see when we're looking at a dominant pedigree, is it's possible for 2 parents to both be colored in, and now suddenly there is a child that is not colored in. That is very similar to our example where we had the 2 purple flowers that were occasionally producing some white offspring from them. If we know that this is a dominant pedigree, we can go through and we can assign a capital letter, at least one capital letter, to all of the individuals that are colored in, and we can assign 2 lowercase letters to all of the individuals that are not colored in. As far as the other half of the dominant individuals, we may or may not be able to decide conclusively the second letter that's going to be in the genotype. If we look at an example of a recessive pedigree, if we're calling it recessive, that means that the colored or shaded individuals, they are going to have the recessive phenotype. That also means that the non-colored in ones would have the dominant phenotype. So if we know that we've got the recessive phenotype for the colored ones, we can assign them 2 lowercase letters. All of the white ones get at least 1 capital letter. For a recessive pedigree, one thing that you commonly see in them, or kind of a dead giveaway, is this right here. You can have 2 parents that don't have it or are not affected. Suddenly we have an offspring that is. So it is possible to have things skip generations when we're talking about a recessive pedigree. Now it's important to keep in mind that if we're looking at a pedigree, it's going to be either dominant or it's going to be recessive. Whatever we decide on is going to apply to the entire pedigree picture. We cannot have half of it be dominant, half of it be recessive. Now there may be one specific area that you look at that you feel really told you specifically whether it was dominant or recessive, but whatever your conclusion is, it is going to apply to the whole thing. If we look at an example of a pedigree, here we have one, and first off we want to decide whether this is a dominant pedigree or it is a recessive pedigree. Now when I look at pedigrees, I usually try to see if there is something there that tells me that this would definitely be a recessive pedigree. In this case, I don't see anything on this one that kind of gives it away as being a recessive pedigree. The type of thing that would give it away as being a recessive pedigree would be when 2 individuals, 2 parents don't have it or are not colored in, and then suddenly they have a child that is colored in. That is not the case. So if we don't see anything that says that it's recessive, I consider dominant the default. So this is going to be a dominant pedigree. One way we could double check that is if you look at one of these individuals at the bottom that actually has it, notice that they have at least 1 parent that has it, and that one has at least 1 parent that has it. So basically we can trace it back up the tree. So now knowing that this is a dominant pedigree, what that is telling us is that all of these that are colored in, they have the dominant phenotype. All of them that are not colored in, they have the recessive phenotype. Knowing that, we can go through and we can start assigning genotypes. So if we use the letter A, and we want to know what is the genotype of Roman numeral 1, 2, that would be this individual right here. So if we use A's, keep in mind that if it is white, it is going to be the recessive phenotype. So that one's going to be little a, little a. In fact, all of the white ones would be little a, little a's. So you could go through, you could write it on every single one of them if you wanted. If we look at this individual, okay, and we want to know their genotype, well, they have the dominant phenotype. So first off, we know that they have 1 capital A. Okay, and initially that really is all we know there. They could be big A, they could be heterozygous. If we look at their offspring, notice, for instance, right here, they had a child that was a little a, little a. Keep in mind that if they had that, that child got a little a from that parent, and they also got a little a from that parent, which tells us that this parent really must be heterozygous. So that parent is heterozygous. So if those 2 individuals were to have another child, what is the probability that he or she will be affected? And by affected, we're saying in this one that this is a dominant pedigree. So we're saying what is the probability that their next child would be dominant? Well, this goes right back to what we did before. We know the parents. These are their genotypes. We just figured that out. And now all we have to do is draw the Punnett square and fill in the boxes. Okay, so if we do that, we can see that the probability that another child would be affected would be 2 out of 4, which is going to reduce down to 1/2. Okay, so that would be our answer there. So if you can determine whether the pedigree is dominant or recessive, then we can go through and start assigning some genotypes, and then we can predict the outcome of some crosses. Now, one reason that pedigrees are drawn quite often is when we're dealing with genetic disorders. So many genetic disorders are inherited in a recessive manner. So if we're talking about something that's inherited in a recessive manner, what that means is that having the disorder is the recessive phenotype. So recessively inherited disorders show up only in individuals that are homozygous for the allele. So this would be someone that is like a little a. And carriers are heterozygous individuals. Carriers do not have the disease. They are phenotypically normal. Most often, they don't even know that they're heterozygous for a particular disease. But we call them carriers because they do possess this bad recessive allele, which they are carrying, and they can potentially pass on to their offspring. So a carrier, we would expect that 50% of the time, they will pass on that allele. If we look over here, when we're talking about genetic disorders that are inherited recessively, most often when individuals have a child with one of these disorders, it comes as a bit of a shock. So they don't expect to have a child with a disorder because it has not previously kind of run in their family. If we look here, we've got two parents that are both going to not have the disorder, but they are both carriers. Okay, because they are carriers, if you work out the cross from those two parents, we would expect that a quarter would be big A, a quarter heterozygous, or half heterozygous, and then we expect that 25% is going to be little a. So 25% of their offspring would be expected to have this particular disorder because both parents had that little a possible there. 3/4 of their children we would expect to not have the disease. If we look at some examples of this, cystic fibrosis is a good example to bring up because this is the most common lethal genetic disease in the United States. It is most common in people of Caucasian or European descent, and the normal allele for this gene codes for an ion channel protein. Okay, so just to emphasize that these genes are telling the cell how to make a protein that is going to be functioning in a particular way inside the cell. Now, this is a progressive disease, which means that symptoms get worse over time. There is mucus buildup in some internal organs, abnormal absorption of nutrients in the small intestines. And while the life expectancy used to be just a few years, with today's treatments, the life expectancy is more in the 20s. So a little longer for a life expectancy, but obviously still a reduced life for sure. So with this one, if we look at a pedigree here, we see that we've got this big family, no cases of cystic fibrosis, and then suddenly towards the bottom, we've got Charles and Eva here, and their first child, Sandy, did not have cystic fibrosis, but their second child, Charlotte, she did. And then their third child, Matthew, he had it as well. And then Peter, the fourth one, does not have it. Well, the reason that someone might decide to go to a genetic counselor and have a pedigree drawn up would be for something just like this. So your family has never had anyone with a genetic disease in it, and then suddenly there is the appearance of it. Once we know that these two have a child, Charlotte, that has cystic fibrosis, she must be little a. Okay, so if she's little a, that tells us that her parents, even though they don't have it, they must both be heterozygous, which is why they were able to have a child that has cystic fibrosis. Matthew must also be little a. Now, from those two parents, we would expect, if you draw the Punnett square, that 25% of their offspring are going to have this disorder. Notice that they have 4 children and 2 of them have the disorder, so 50%. Keep in mind that each child is an independent event, so it's a new probability each time that 25%, yes, they will have it, 75%, no, they will not. Now, if you had, say, a brother or sister that had a child with cystic fibrosis, that means that your brother or sister was a carrier. So for someone like Harold over here, they might become concerned that if my sibling had a child with cystic fibrosis, maybe I could as well. So this is where the genetic testing comes into play a lot of times. Harold could be a carrier, right? Because if this one has a little a, they must have gotten it from a parent up here. Harold does happen to be a carrier. And in this pedigree, it's designated by the little dot that we see in the middle of the individuals. Sometimes it's shown as a dot, sometimes it's shown as them being halfway shaded in, but he is a carrier. If he knew that he was a carrier, his wife may get tested to find out if she is a carrier. In this case, she is not, so that means that she's a big A, big A. If that is their genotypes, then it's really not possible for them to have a child that would have cystic fibrosis. However, they could have a child that's a carrier. Okay, so that might be something they would want to tell their children so that they could make an informed decision about genetic testing and things of that nature. So it is a good picture of a recessive pedigree on here, and it shows you how recessive disorders are typically inherited. Now, with any of the diseases and disorders that we go through, you don't need to memorize any of the symptoms or anything like that, but just know that if you, on your exam, have a disorder that is caused by a recessive or is inherited in a recessive manner, that means that having the disorder is the recessive phenotype. If we go back to one of our examples we've used all along, sickle cell disease, and it is inherited in a recessive manner. It is the most common inherited disease of people of African descent. We've talked about the causes of it, but here in this picture it gives you another good look at a recessive pedigree. This individual over here, they have sickle cell, so they would be the little a, and if they're little a, well, their parents must have both been carriers, actually. So we can shade them in and designate them as carriers if we wanted to here. Notice that this one's siblings over here must have been a carrier because they also had a child that had sickle cell down here. These three individuals, if they've got a brother that has sickle cell, they could potentially be carriers, so they may want to get tested as well. So recessive disorders can skip generations, and we do call carriers individuals that are heterozygous. We don't consider a carrier to have the disease. They simply carry the bad allele. Now, if we talk a little bit about matings between relatives, or what's commonly called inbreeding. Inbreeding can increase the probability of the appearance of a genetic disease. It can increase the probability. It does not necessarily mean that there will be a genetic disease in the offspring. These are called consanguineous matings or same blood matings. If we look at a pedigree where there is going to be some inbreeding, there is a little double line here. I don't know if you can see that there's a double line there, but that double line indicates that we do have inbreeding. Well, the reason that this is going to increase the probability of getting a genetic disease in the offspring is because you do share a lot of DNA with your relatives, obviously. There are many genetic disorders out there, and we're all predicted to be carriers for some number of genetic disorders. However, since there are so many genetic disorders out there, the chance that you are a carrier for the same genetic diseases as some other person that you would randomly meet in the human population, that chance is pretty slim. It does happen because we do end up with some individuals that have, say, sickle cell anemia, and some people that have cystic fibrosis and so on. But it is fairly uncommon that you are going to be a carrier for the same diseases as someone that you randomly meet. However, the people that are going to be carriers for the same ones as you are the people that are closely related to you. So if you do both happen to be carriers for the same disorder, keep in mind that we predict that 25% of the offspring are going to be little a, and that means they're going to have that disease. 75% of the offspring, though, we expect, are not going to have the disease because they're going to have at least a capital A there. So it really is a matter of just increasing the probability that you both have that little a, and it's going to come together in the offspring. When we do have cases, some cases of incest sometimes in the news, sometimes you do have offspring that have a particularly rare genetic disorder. The reason that it's a rare disorder is because there are so few people in the population that actually are carriers for that. But again, people that are closely related do run a pretty good chance of both being carriers for it. This picture of this pedigree down here at the bottom is just to emphasize that it does not take inbreeding to get a recessive disorder to appear. So there is no inbreeding in this one down here, and we do still have some individuals at the bottom that have that genetic disorder. Now, not all genetic disorders are inherited in a recessive manner. Some of them are due to dominant alleles. The polydactyly, the extra digit that we looked at earlier in chapter 14, some people would consider that a genetic disorder, so that would be an example here. Another example is a type of dwarfism called achondroplasia. So this form of dwarfism is lethal when you're homozygous dominant. So actually, if you do have individuals that have achondroplasia, we kind of know that they are going to be heterozygous for sure, because it's lethal if there's two big A's there. However, with dominant disorders, it's usually a pretty good assumption if someone has a disorder, they are going to be heterozygous. So if someone has this type of dwarfism, they have one big A. We would expect that if they have offspring, 50% of the chance they pass on the big A, 50% of the time they pass on the lowercase a. So we would expect that half of their offspring are also going to have achondroplasia. Half of their offspring would not have the achondroplasia. If we look at another example, Huntington's disease is caused by a dominant allele as well. So if someone has this, they would have one capital A, one lowercase a, because again, it's relatively rare. This is a degenerative disease of the nervous system, which means that it is a slow kind of wasting away of the nervous system. Keep in mind that the nervous system controls a lot of things. So for these individuals, they eventually lose all function. They lose their minds. They cannot take care of themselves. They typically end up in a nursing home. And this particular disease does not have any obvious phenotypic effects until the individual is about 35 to 40 years old. So that means they are very normal until, say, they're 35 or 40 years old, at which point they start to have some symptoms appear. Sometimes it is a very quick onset and fast death. Sometimes it is very slow and drawn out. However, if you were at risk of having Huntington's disease, because it is a dominant disorder, you would know if you were at risk. Because, as we said before, with dominant disorders, these cannot skip generations. So if you thought you might have it, you would have at least one parent that had this disorder as well. So as we said before, if they're heterozygous, half of the time we expect that they're going to pass on the capital A, half the time they're going to pass on the lowercase a. Really doesn't matter what the other parent is, because if you pass on that big A, your children are going to have this particular disease. With this one, because there's no phenotypic effects until 35 or 40 years old, many individuals have already had children at that point, so they have already potentially passed this disease on to their offspring. There is a genetic disorder for this, or a genetic test for this one now that you can get to see if you carry that allele. Again, you would know if it ran in your family. If it did run in your family, you could get the test and you could find out if you were going to get Huntington's disease when you got older. Some people would decide that they want to have the test and they would want to know. Okay, but you have to realize what that knowledge may mean to you. It may mean that you're going to have a pretty rough, terrible life when you hit 35 or 40 years old. It may also end up being good news. So some people would prefer to know, others would prefer not to know. So there are a lot of personal things that come into play when we talk about genetic testing. Now, many human diseases are not simple cases of genetics. So many have both genetic and environmental components. Heart disease is a very good example of this. Many people know that heart disease runs in their family. That does not necessarily mean that they are going to get heart disease. So there are certainly environmental things that you can do to help control your risk of getting heart disease. You can control your diet, you can exercise, so that hopefully you can lower that risk. Some cancers are also hereditary, but again, it's not a 100% chance that you're going to get that particular cancer. You can try to lower your risk. There are things that can be done. So when we're talking about those types of disorders, drawing out the pedigree is not so helpful because we don't get the nice clear-cut pattern that we had before. Now you do want to take a look at the practice questions. You've got some example pedigree questions there. Make sure that you can look at a pedigree picture and determine whether it's a recessive pedigree or a dominant pedigree, and then be able to predict the potential offspring that the individuals could have. And then we did look at a number of example diseases, but with those you don't need to memorize any of the diseases and their symptoms. We simply want to know that if you're presented with a disease and you're told that it's inherited in a recessive or a dominant manner, you know what that means, and you could then work out some genetic crosses based on that information.